Policies aimed at attackers. Cybersecurity policies can either target attackers, the criminals or malicious actors responsible for perpetrating breaches, or the ecosystem of interconnected defenders, organizations, and individuals with the ability to help prevent those attackers from achieving their ultimate aims. Laws like the CFAA in the United States or the Computer Misuse Act in the United Kingdom are examples of policies that target attackers. They criminalize certain activities, for example, unauthorized access to computers, enabling law enforcement authorities to prosecute and punish offenders directly. Policies that directly target attackers tend to focus primarily on criminalizing access, leading to considerable controversy and disagreement around what constitutes unauthorized access or access in excess of authorization in the context of a computer system. The CFAA, for instance, gives the following definition of the latter activity: to access a computer with authorization and to use such access to obtain or alter information in the computer that the accessor is not entitled to so obtain or alter, implying a fairly broad set of capabilities centered on data exfiltration and editing that could be considered access. Even though accessing computers is typically just one step in a larger breach, policies designed to directly target and punish malicious actors focus on the initial access-oriented stages of attacks, rather than the ultimate harm, such as financial fraud or espionage, since those harms are often already covered by existing laws. In many cases, this makes sense to avoid redundant policymaking, but it also contributes to the emphasis placed on the earliest technical stages of attacks in breach postmortems, as well as the challenges of trying to figure out how to classify and punish types of harm that don't always fit neatly into existing statutes. Denial-of-service attacks present a particular challenge for policies that target attackers, because this type of attack typically harms a particular victim, such as Spamhaus, not through illicit or unauthorized access to that victim's computers, but rather through unauthorized access to many other people's computers. At least 2 people allegedly involved in orchestrating the attacks on Spamhaus have since been arrested and charged under the Computer Misuse Act. However, it is unclear whether their crime was in flooding Spamhaus's web servers, harmful but not unauthorized, since the web servers were indeed designed to receive queries from external machines, or using compromised hosts to do so. Accessing those hosts to send outbound traffic was unauthorized, but not directly harmful to the hosts themselves. Similarly, in 2013, when 13 people associated with Anonymous were indicted in the United States under the CFAA for launching a series of distributed denial-of-service attacks directed at the copyright industry, the indictment charged that the individuals had conspired to intentionally cause damage and attempt to cause damage without authorization to a protected computer, causing loss to victims resulting from the course of conduct affecting protected computers, aggregating at least $5,000 in value. But the targeted servers belonging to the organizations that actually incurred those losses had not been accessed in a clearly unauthorized manner. They were intended to receive outside queries, and the computers that had been used without authorization to bombard the targeted servers incurred no such financial losses. Attempts to use policy to punish attackers for denial-of-service incidents sometimes conflate the technical access to intermediary machines required to carry out an attack and the ultimate harm directed at a slightly different set of victims. While arresting and punishing attackers directly is an important role, and one that governments are undoubtedly uniquely suited to. There are several reasons policymakers may wish to extend their reach beyond criminal-focused regulations to influence defenders. The challenges of attribution and international investigation make it difficult to identify and prosecute responsible parties in many cybercrime cases. For instance, the perpetrators of the South Carolina Department of Revenue, DigiNotar, and Ashley Madison breaches have never been reliably identified. Meanwhile, PLA Unit 61398 officers responsible for cyber espionage efforts, as well as Yevgeny Bogachev, the man responsible for Game Over Zeus and CryptoLocker, have all been identified by the U.S. government, but remain out of the reach of its judicial system so long as they reside overseas, in countries that refuse to arrest them. Ultimately, given these limitations on catching and prosecuting criminals, a government that wants to prevent or mitigate threats must look to policies that govern intermediary actors and the security measures they have in place. Perhaps the strongest incentive for governments to develop security policies that target intermediaries and defenders is simply that those actors are identifiable and, to some extent, cooperative and governable within a national context. A government cannot reach every attacker who targets its citizens, but it can, to varying degrees, attempt to reach and regulate every company that carries traffic, stores data, and provides services within its borders. National policies can still play an important role in punishing international bad actors. In fact, recent policy efforts in the United States have focused on trying to cut off money flows to criminals outside the country's borders. The Deter Cyber Theft Act, introduced in the U.S. Senate in June 2014, for instance, proposed to block imports of products manufactured overseas by companies that the U.S. government found to have benefited from cyber espionage. Measures in the controversial U.S. Stop Online Piracy Act, SOPA, introduced in the House of Representatives in 2011 but never passed, were similarly designed to cut off income sources for perpetrators of online crimes. Since SOPA targeted infringing intermediary websites rather than imports, however, it took a slightly different approach than the Deter Cyber Theft Act. Its provisions would have prevented online advertising and payment companies from conducting business with infringing websites, required U.S. service providers to block access to those sites, and forbidden search engines from linking to them. SOPA and its Senate counterpart, the Protect IP, PIPA bill, had the same broad goals as the Deter Cyber Theft Act, rendering cybercrime less profitable, foiling criminals by cutting off their financial flows, and mitigating the economic harm inflicted on U.S. industry by international actors. But the means by which SOPA and PIPA proposed to accomplish these goals required extensive involvement of Internet intermediaries, the advertising companies, payment processors, service providers, and search engines who would have carried out the policy measures in accordance with court orders. The measures proposed in the Deter Cyber Theft Act targeted physical imports rather than online content, and were therefore more direct, requiring the involvement of fewer intermediaries. Notably, none of these bills were passed into law. Indeed, SOPA and PIPA met with almost unprecedented public backlash from many major websites and tech firms who rallied users in January 2012 to protest both bills as they appeared to be nearing passage. Unsurprisingly, those companies were unenthusiastic about the idea that they might be forced to assume greater responsibility for policing online misbehavior and face greater penalties for failing to do so. There were other reasons people objected to SOPA and PIPA. The bills took a broad view of what constituted a foreign infringing site, and therefore might well have been susceptible to misuse by people or firms looking for a way to block websites, even in the absence of egregious infringement activity. The outcry over SOPA and PIPA reinforced just how aggressively stakeholders were willing to fight to ensure they would not have to shoulder any additional responsibility for stopping online crime. SOPA and PIPA, as well as the Deter Cyber Theft Act, are all early examples of failed attempts at crafting policies that take advantage of the power online intermediaries have to mitigate harm and stymie cybercriminals. They offer flawed but thought-provoking templates for how governments can attempt to mitigate financial harms through manipulation of both international trade and domestic markets and intermediaries. They also represent Congress's attempts to think creatively about how to wield policy within the confines of their national jurisdiction by regulating only U.S.-based companies, while still trying to have a significant international impact on cybercriminals located outside the country. The strengthening of international cooperation around law enforcement efforts and the development of global norms governing cyber threats are both clearly crucial for the future landscape of computer security policy. National efforts on their own are unlikely to provide sufficient protection or consistency for firms and individuals operating in a global context. Furthering these international efforts should be a central focus of every government looking to engage with computer security issues. Long-term, the most promising policy outcomes for computer security may derive from strong, detailed, and comprehensive international partnerships. But this seems like a distant goal at a moment when the United States, Russia, and China, three of the most powerful and technically sophisticated governments in the world, seem incapable of agreeing on anything related to cybersecurity, and are instead actively antagonizing each other online through election meddling, filing criminal charges against military officers and government informants, and blatantly disregarding the other's charges and calls for extradition. Especially in the aftermath of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, during which U.S. intelligence officials said the Russian government stole and leaked information to influence the results, strong international cooperation and partnerships on cybersecurity policy and cybercrime enforcement do not seem imminent. As nations struggle to find common ground on these issues, and even in some cases indicate their mistrust of each other's motives and activities, the short-term future of cybersecurity policy, at least, seems destined to involve national governments taking more unilateral action and implementing policies within their own borders aimed at defenders and intermediary stakeholders. The United States is in a uniquely powerful position to put in place national regulations with far-reaching international consequences, since so many of the largest online intermediaries are based in the U.S., and so much of the information and money targeted by cybercriminals also comes from U.S. users and organizations. Defender-oriented policy levers. Policymakers can impose three types of requirements on defenders: ex-ante safety regulation, ex-post liability, and information reporting or disclosure. Preemptive defensive controls, or ex-ante safety measures, include encrypting sensitive data, implementing a firewall, mandating password length and complexity, and organizing security efforts according to a set process. Liability regimes, by contrast, focus on security outcomes, or the responsibility of a defender to make some baseline efforts to prevent certain types of damage, For example, host infection, data theft, financial fraud, but leave the specific means by which those outcomes will be avoided to the discretion of the defenders by never specifying what those ex-ante baseline efforts should look like. Finally, reporting responsibilities, which have been the focus of many existing and proposed security policies to date, deal with what security-related information defenders must reveal and to whom. Though they tend to be handled under separate policies, all of these types of security responsibilities are interrelated. Preemptive measures are only useful insofar as they help defenders achieve positive outcomes. Outcomes can only be measured by means of robust reporting, and reported information is only relevant if it can be used to inform the actions defenders should take and assess the associated outcomes. Each of these categories of responsibilities, focused on controls, outcomes, and reporting, may be applied to defenders with different degrees of pressure. Policymakers may choose to present any of these responsibilities as mandatory, incentivized, or voluntary for defenders. These three levels of pressure correspond to different broad categories of policy: rules, which recommend or prohibit certain behaviors; inducements, which seek to encourage those behaviors through pressure or rewards; and information, which aims to influence behavior solely through the provision of knowledge about breaches, security controls, and potential threats. With the exception of the breach reporting laws enacted in most states in the United States, cybersecurity policies that target defenders have tended toward the voluntary end of this spectrum, with several governments providing suggested guidelines for security controls, including the NIST 800 to 853 catalog, educational materials for organizations and end users, and voluntary codes of conduct for industry actors, but relatively few concrete incentives or rules around these issues. Instead, regulators have largely deferred to industry to take the lead on trying to develop security guidelines and best practices for the private sector, encouraging companies to do so at the risk of otherwise incurring more burdensome regulation. In June 2014, Tom Wheeler, who was then the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, spoke at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, outlining his agency's approach to dealing with cybersecurity threats in the communications sector. He said, "We believe there is a new regulatory paradigm where the Commission relies on industry and the market first, while preserving other options if that approach is unsuccessful. We have agreed that industry-based solutions are the right approach. The question is, will this approach work? We're not Pollyannas. We will implement this approach and measure results. It is those results that will tell us what, if any, next steps must be taken." Wheeler's remarks outline a wait-and-see approach to cybersecurity regulations, in which a regulator declines to set clear rules telling companies what they should do to protect their computer systems, but instead uses the potential threat of such rules to urge industry actors to self-regulate. The challenge for regulators taking this approach lies in measuring how effective that self-regulation has been. Wheeler himself calls out the importance of measuring the results of industry efforts several times in his June 2014 speech. At one point telling the audience, "In business school, I learned, if you can measure it, you can manage it." But computer security is not an easy or straightforward thing to measure. To assess how secure a computer system is, should one measure how many times intruders are able to access it? Or how much damage those intrusions do in dollars? Or how many controls are in place to protect it? Or how many vulnerabilities can be found in those defenses during testing? And how does one factor into those metrics the fact that not all intrusions and vulnerabilities are equally serious, not all security controls are equally useful, and not all intrusions are associated with clear dollar costs. Wheeler's wait-and-see approach relied on the government's being able to assess how well industry was doing at defending itself without regulatory intervention. But ultimately, he was completely dependent on companies measuring their own progress and reporting back their self-selected metrics to the government. For instance, one of the policy initiatives Wheeler discussed during his talk was the voluntary Anti-Bot Code of Conduct for Internet Service Providers, or ABCs for ISPs, developed by the FCC's Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, CSRIC. The Anti-Bot Code provided a series of recommendations to ISPs on how to mitigate bots, like Game Over Zeus, using their ability to track suspicious-looking traffic patterns online and identify or even quarantine customers whose computers appear to be infected. The code was developed in partnership with several industry representatives who sat on the CSRIC, and it gave all ISPs not just the freedom to decide whether or not they wanted to implement the entirely voluntary recommendations, but also to decide whether or not they wanted to reveal which recommendations, if any, they had adopted. In other words, not only were the bot mitigation measures optional, the FCC didn't even know whether any ISPs were using them. How then could the agency hope to measure or independently assess the impact of those self-imposed measures? It was an approach that seemed at odds with Wheeler's own demand, as articulated in his talk at AEI, for cybersecurity efforts that were more demonstrably effective than blindly trusting the market. He added, "The bottom line is that this new paradigm can't be happy talk about good ideas. It has to work in the real world." The month following Wheeler's speech at AEI, the FCC issued a request for comments on the voluntary recommendations for ISPs. The request asked service providers and others to comment on questions including, what progress have stakeholders made in implementing the recommendations? What significant success stories or breakthroughs have been achieved in implementing the recommendations? What are stakeholders' views and/or plans for full implementation of the recommendations? How effective are the recommendations at mitigating cyber risk when they have been implemented? The FCC was trying to determine whether anyone had adopted or planned to adopt the recommended voluntary security practices, and if so, what impact those measures had. Questions the FCC had no answers to, because the Anti-Bot Code made no concrete demands on any defenders to implement specific measures, or even to disclose which measures they adopted. Perhaps the most comprehensive response to the FCC's call for comments came from the Messaging, Malware, and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group, M3AAWG, a non-profit consortium made up primarily of representatives from various ISPs and network operators. M3AAWG asked its members to volunteer information about how many infected hosts they had identified on their networks, and found that, of the ISPs who volunteered information, in 2012 and 2013, the number of infected hosts ranged from 0.67% to 1.31%, and roughly 98.7% of the end users who owned those hosts were notified of the possible infection. Beyond providing a rough estimate of how many end users were notified of infected hosts, the comments provided little by way of assessing how many ISPs had adopted the ABCs, or whether it had had any noticeable impact on the growth of bots. The FCC took no further steps, not to gather more data, to set benchmarks for progress, or to implement more stringent rules. The problem of determining whether their market-driven approach was working and deciding whether ISP self-regulation was effective appeared to be intractable for the agency. Wheeler's plan for the FCC to help develop a robust set of security metrics to assess progress would turn out to be no more than happy talk about a good idea. This inability to measure the impact of different security measures and tactics has stymied many policymakers, not just the FCC, in their efforts to set clear and effective cybersecurity policies. It's similar to the problem that the FTC ran into when Wyndham challenged its authority to deem the hotel group's security practices unreasonable because the agency had never specified what constituted a reasonable baseline level of security. In a motion denying Wyndham's request to dismiss the suit, Judge Esther Salas noted that the FTC does not plead the particularized data security rules or regulations that hotels and resorts procedures allegedly failed to comply with, but maintained that this cannot preclude the FTC's enforcement action. For the FTC, a crucial part of defining security liability regimes is being able to distinguish between breaches where defenders were negligent in their responsibility to provide reasonable security to their customers, and other incidents where defenders were just unlucky in facing adversaries skilled enough to overcome the expected level of standard defenses. This standards-based approach speaks to the interplay between the different types of policy measures. Ex post liability is determined in part by ex ante precautions, which comes back to the question, best addressed through reporting policies, of which of those precautions are actually important and effective. The FTC does not specify what security practices companies must have in place to avoid liability, in part because they do not know which controls are most effective. They have no way to measure that. And also, in part, because the effectiveness of different controls can change over time as the threat landscape shifts and new vulnerabilities and attack techniques emerge. This sense that security guidelines need to be regularly reassessed and updated is an important reason why both the FCC and the FTC, as well as many other government agencies, have been reluctant to enshrine any specific set of ex-ante protective requirements in regulations, and have preferred to leave those decisions to industry, where the assumption is people can make changes to their security posture and adapt to new threats more quickly and easily. Both uncertainty around what the most effective measures are and a reluctance to issue inflexible legislation around these issues have led policymakers to explore other options. In particular, governments dissatisfied with the success of purely voluntary regimes have focused significant attention on the role of incentives in driving cybersecurity policy, discussing options that range from tax incentives and liability limitations to government funding and technical assistance. The area where industry stakeholders enjoy the least flexibility in terms of ex-ante precautions is in the security requirements for services and systems sold to the government itself. For instance, OPM cited the U.S. government's FedRAMP certification process as the reason it did not implement Silence Protect sooner to defend its computer systems. Certifications like FedRAMP, which label products sufficiently secure for government use, provide an example of a rules-based approach, rather than the FTC's standards-based approach, centered on what others are doing, and can serve as a strong incentive for companies to alter their security practices in order to be able to sell to government agencies. Another model for how governments have tried to incentivize specific security actions is the UK Cyber Essentials scheme, in which businesses can be awarded cybersecurity badges by the government for implementing a set list of security controls. This labeling scheme certifies that badge recipients have implemented 5 types of security controls: boundary firewalls, internet gateways, secure configuration, user access control, and malware protection. Still, there are relatively few government cybersecurity policies with formal incentives built into them. Instead, the primary incentive for adoption of voluntary security practices has been the avoidance of further regulation threatened by policymakers like Wheeler. Applying mandatory or even incentivized security measures to broad classes of diffuse stakeholders presents considerable enforcement problems. A government cannot easily enforce a policy requiring every Internet user or organization within its borders to adopt a standard set of security practices. Moreover, such a policy would ignore the unique risks, processes, and preferences of each of those organizations and users, and would also require constant updating to keep up with new threats. So, many governments haven't laid out security standards, choosing instead to defer to private industry's expertise. Therefore, specific security controls are often implemented through voluntary policies or private contracts, as in the case of the payment card industry data security standards that individual merchants agree to in order to process payment card transactions. Voluntary adoption and private agreements of this nature sometimes have the advantage of being more quickly updated than government policies, but allowing the payment card industry to dictate the security responsibilities of other stakeholders has drawbacks as well. After all, the payment networks who dictated the liability shift for microchip-enabled cards themselves serve as a crucial line of defense in the aftermath of many financially motivated breaches, given their unique ability to detect and mitigate fraud. So it's not clear that allowing them to dictate who is responsible for what, and offloading liability onto other stakeholders who have less sophisticated fraud detection abilities, is in the best interests of consumers. Balancing the responsibilities of different stakeholders is difficult when one party or group has the unilateral authority to decide when another should be held liable. Different levels of pressure may be better suited to certain types of security responsibilities. Ex-ante defensive measures, which evolve rapidly with threats and can be relatively specific to particular defenders, may not be well suited to rules or inducements. Ex-post liability for bad outcomes, on the other hand, requires forms of policy that exert more pressure on defenders, along the lines of the FTC enforcement efforts and class action lawsuits brought against TJX, the SCDOR, Ashley Madison, and others. But these attempts to define liability regimes hinge on some understanding of the ex-ante defensive measures that organizations are supposed to have in place in order to determine whether they should be held liable for a security incident. This leaves policymakers and courts stuck in a difficult cycle of trying over and over again to define who should be held liable for a security incident without specifying what exactly an organization must do in order not to be held liable. This interplay between ex-ante and ex-post security policies contributes to the uncertainty and tentativeness with which policymakers have typically approached cybersecurity issues. They want to leave ambiguous the question of what technical controls organizations should be using, both because that list may change over time and because they have no good way of measuring which controls are most effective. So those ex-ante measures are only proposed as voluntary policies in most sectors. But that ambiguity, in turn, feeds a high degree of uncertainty surrounding the ex-post liability regimes these same organizations face in the aftermath of an incident, making it especially difficult to hold third-party intermediaries liable when they had no well-defined security responsibilities at the outset. The only area of cybersecurity policy where U.S.-based firms routinely face mandatory regulation is breach reporting, perhaps because few companies would want to admit to a security breach in the absence of a legal requirement. Different stakeholders have particular perspectives and sets of capabilities that can be leveraged to protect not just themselves, but also their customers, co-workers, and even complete strangers. The value of a policy such as the CSRIC's Anti-Bot Code of Conduct lies largely in its ability to recognize the particular, unique roles an individual type of stakeholder, in this case ISPs, can play, and ensuring that those actors implement defensive measures to protect not just themselves, but also others. Just as security controls for applications need to be tailored to the application's function, and security controls for organizations need to be tailored to firms' missions and computer uses, so, too, cybersecurity policies must be tailored to the specific capabilities and roles of the intermediaries they affect. Policies should ideally be targeted at the class or classes of stakeholders best situated to have the ultimate desired defensive impact. In some cases, it may not be immediately clear either which sector or which individual actors within a given sector are in that position. This excess of intermediaries, stemming from the interconnected nature of the Internet, makes it even more important that policymakers clarify the roles and responsibilities of all involved. While no defender can be said to be responsible for security breaches in the same manner that perpetrators are, some may routinely forego commonly accepted security measures and practices, thereby enabling intruders. Stakeholders who could serve a defensive role may even profit from security breaches, for instance, by marketing themselves as hosts with few scruples and a shady clientele, as many of the infrastructure providers who comprised the Stophouse Group did. Other stakeholders may not be defensive weak links, but instead offer convenient choke points for cutting off certain types of threats in an efficient manner at their crucial bottleneck stages. Policymaking in this space should reflect the complex interactions between the wide variety of stakeholders involved in defending against these threats and the limitations of any individual group's reach and capabilities in that context. There is no exhaustive list or uniform categorization of those groups, especially given that the appropriate categories and granularity may vary from policy to policy. Several examples of different, potentially policy-relevant classes of stakeholders who could serve as defensive choke points for certain bottleneck stages of intrusions are described in Table 13.1. This list is not meant to be exhaustive, but rather to highlight the capabilities and defensive potential of many of the recurring stakeholders involved in the cases discussed in the previous chapters. The ultimate aim of policymakers is to mitigate the harm caused by security incidents, and it may therefore be useful to frame some policies in terms of the desired outcomes, rather than the specific security controls and techniques intended to achieve those outcomes. For instance, a policymaker concerned about the problem of botnets is not worried about the existence of bots, but rather the potential of those bots to be used to inflict economic harm by means of financial fraud, denial of service attacks, or other avenues. That policymaker's ultimate goal is probably not to reduce rates of malware infection, or even to reduce the size and number of active bots, but rather to reduce the amount of economic damage that is inflicted with those bots. Crafting policies around anti-malware protections and anti-bot practices for service providers are ways of trying to move closer to that goal, but such strategies are not the only or even necessarily the most effective means of doing so. An alternative strategy might center on cutting off payments to the operators of bots, thereby preventing the economic profit even while the technical threat, the bot, remains active. For instance, a policy that makes it more difficult or even illegal for people to purchase or use cryptocurrencies could serve as a means of making it harder for victims to pay criminals when infected with ransomware like CryptoLocker, thereby demonetizing that model of cybercrime. This economic perspective is also partly the rationale behind policies like the Deter Cybertheft Act, which focus on thwarting perpetrators' ultimate aims, profit, rather than trying to go after the technical means by which they steal intellectual property. Table 13.1 is available as a downloadable PDF. Not all intruders have financial motives, but where they do, policymakers can wield considerable control over financial flows. Focusing in this manner on the ultimate threat of harm posed by a security compromise, rather than the technical details that enabled it, may in some cases guide policymakers toward more targeted and creative solutions. On the other hand, a policy like the Deter Cybertheft Act would rely so heavily on the government being able to reliably detect and attribute cybercrimes before the perpetrators could extract their profits that it's not clear how feasible or effective such a solution would be. Policies aimed at security outcomes need not be exclusively focused on an attacker's end goal. Rather, they may center on the end goals of the defensive stakeholders to which they apply. Policymakers may try to specify either how those stakeholders should address threats, i.e., which security controls should be implemented, or instead, what they should aim to achieve when tackling those threats, i.e., which outcomes to strive for. A policy for hardware manufacturers might therefore give specific guidelines for combating supply chain counterfeit, or instead detail metrics for assessing the extent of such counterfeit and benchmarks for driving down those cases, leaving it to the affected firm's discretion how they want to meet those benchmarks. Similarly, policies aimed at end users might specify actions, for example, installing security updates, or designate outcomes that those users are responsible for avoiding, such as the participation of their machines in bots. Holding stakeholders responsible for the security outcomes that result from their actions, rather than the specific actions they must take, allows them more freedom in designing their own security strategies and tailoring those strategies to their business and needs. In some cases, where defenders have limited security resources and expertise, they may not want that freedom. Instead, they may prefer to have a set of clear and concrete security controls laid out for them and be held accountable only for whether they have implemented those, regardless of whatever else may go wrong. In other instances, however, especially for stakeholders with significant resources and expertise in this area, it may be preferable to allow industry actors who encounter these threats directly to craft their own customized set of security measures. This approach has the advantage of enabling rapid updating and development of security controls, while also keeping policies more focused on the attacker's end goals rather than individual defensive maneuvers. Security outcomes are significantly more static than actions. While the specific technical means by which threats propagate are constantly evolving, the ultimate aims, and even the intermediate aims, of malicious actors have remained fairly consistent over time. Financial gain, political and economic espionage, and system disruption or degradation continue to motivate cybercriminals, and these actors continue to use a fairly stable set of tools, including malware, botnets, and denial-of-service attacks, to achieve those aims. The primary drawback to designing policies around outcomes rather than actions is that the former are often challenging to measure or verify, as Wheeler quickly discovered. Accordingly, there has been relatively little policymaking focused on these outcomes, as it is nearly impossible to implement an effective outcomes-based regime in the absence of comprehensive reporting responsibilities that go far beyond the current status quo for security reporting. Security reporting policies. Policies that govern ex-ante defensive measures and ex-post liability regimes should be shaped by the information the stakeholders responsible for those controls or outcomes report in order to ensure compliance and measure progress. Conveniently, reporting requirements represent the area of security policy where regulators have been most active. However, depending on their purpose, these reporting policies can vary greatly with regard to what information stakeholders are expected to report and to whom. These policies can have several different goals, including protecting people whose information has been breached, helping others to defend against threats that have been previously experienced or identified, and contributing to a better understanding of the types of threats observed and the effectiveness of various countermeasures. Each of these three goals has very different implications for security reporting regimes, as described in Table 13.2, and may pose different challenges for both defenders and regulators. The oldest and most common template for computer security reporting policies is the Data Security Breach Notification Law, an early example of which was enacted in California in 2002. That law, SB 1386, requires everyone who conducts business in California to notify any resident of California whose unencrypted personal information was or is reasonably believed to have been acquired by an unauthorized person. Since then, most other states in the U.S. have adopted similar laws requiring that data breaches of personal information be disclosed shortly following their discovery. These breach notification laws are distinct from another set of reporting policies, often referred to as cybersecurity information sharing policies, which are aimed not at the notification of users affected by security breaches, but rather at the other entities that may need to defend themselves against similar threats. For instance, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, CISA, passed by Congress in 2015, focuses on shielding companies from being held liable for sharing threat information that may aid others' defense efforts. Unlike state breach notification laws, CISA does not actually mandate any reporting or information sharing on the part of the firms. Instead, it serves to eliminate potential legal obstacles. There are several industry and government organizations and consortiums that also facilitate information sharing for the purposes of real-time threat mitigation and help spread the word about emerging threats. For instance, a set of Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, ISACs, perform this function with varying degrees of success for several specific industry sectors, including the automotive, financial services, communications, healthcare, and electricity sectors, among others. ISACs are typically non-profit organizations that collect information from their member companies on a voluntary basis. So, the success and effectiveness of each individual ISAC is generally dependent on the level of participation from and access to the firms in its respective industry sector. Moreover, most threat intelligence data collected by ISACs is not made publicly available in order to protect users, so its utility is limited to other members. This secrecy can help encourage greater sharing, but at the same time it restricts how widely threat intelligence can be aggregated and dispersed. The ISACs are not the only existing institutions for facilitating real-time threat intelligence sharing and incident response. Computer Emergency Readiness Teams, CERTs, as well as Computer Security Incident Response Teams, CSIRTs, also operate all over the world and are often run or coordinated by government agencies. These organizations, many of which collaborate through the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, typically collect and publish information on computer vulnerabilities and threats, and also help victims respond to security problems they are facing. As the success of many CERTs, CSIRTs, and ISACs indicates, facilitating the sharing of threat information for real-time response and mitigation purposes is not purely a job for policymakers, though governments have often played a role in setting up CERTs and tend to have a particular interest in the question of when such information can be shared between private companies and government agencies. Table 13.2 is available as a downloadable PDF. Beyond reporting breaches and sharing threat intelligence, there is another important role of reporting responsibilities that is less commonly promoted by policymakers, but gets directly at questions of how they can do a better job of clarifying ex-ante defense and ex-post mitigation policies. Data collection for the purpose of measuring the types of threats defenders face and the effectiveness of different strategies at defending against those threats. Reporting policies trying to achieve this goal would not help individuals or companies protect themselves against current threats and risks in the short term, but would instead focus on what can be learned from threat trends and defensive strategies over time and across a large number of incidents and actors. Policymakers have different roles to play in promoting each of these three goals of security reporting policies. All three may be challenging for private actors to address adequately in the absence of government intervention, but for different reasons. For instance, industry actors may be reluctant or unwilling to notify customers of security breaches for fear of damaging their reputations or incurring legal action. Policymakers who want to ensure that individuals are aware of any breaches of their personal information and the consequent risks can overcome these obstacles by mandating notification procedures. Voluntary and even incentivized policies are unlikely to be widely effective given the potential drawbacks of notifying the breached parties. Real-time threat information sharing between defenders may be hindered by some of the same fears, particularly concerns about litigation and liability that arise from sharing sensitive information or publicizing security breaches, as well as logistical and competitive considerations. Logistically, private actors may not always have easy avenues for spreading threat information to all of the other defenders who could benefit from it. Furthermore, given that some of these defenders are competitors, firms may not want to share that information with everyone else who could use it. The varied security resources and expertise of industry actors also mean that a small number of firms, those with the largest investments in security, are likely to glean most of the threat information, and their smaller peers are likely to have relatively little novel intelligence to offer in exchange. This inequity creates a heavily imbalanced information-sharing ecosystem, in which the defenders who have the most valuable information to share have little incentive to do so with those who would potentially have the most to gain from receiving it. Policymakers wishing to encourage information sharing between defenders to combat real-time threats have several options to try to lessen these barriers. One possible role for policy is to absolve the sharers of liability for providing that information to others, but this runs counter to trying to clarify or strengthen different stakeholders' sense of their security responsibilities. Another possible role of policy could be to create channels for government organizations to provide industry with real-time threat intelligence. CISA includes versions of both of these measures in efforts to facilitate both more private-to-private sharing and government-industry sharing. Coordinating information-sharing efforts through a centralized government authority is another potential function of policy and may help address the logistic and competitive barriers to sharing. But a government-centric model, of the sort adopted by the European Union, also presents drawbacks. In particular, information sharing done for the purpose of real-time threat mitigation requires very rapid turnaround that may be hindered by the insertion of a government body between private defenders. In terms of the third potential function of security reporting, collecting data on threat trends and countermeasure efficacy, government actors can help industry actors overcome a similar set of obstacles related to the challenges of collective action. While such data would potentially be valuable to nearly all defenders individually, many firms are reluctant to champion such an effort in the absence of participation by their peers. No company wants to be the first to release that data about the threats they see and the impact of their countermeasures, for fear of drawing attention to their security incidents. Furthermore, no company stands to gain anything by unilaterally releasing such information, since they benefit only by what they learn from others and the creation of a broader data set beyond what they already know internally. Mandating that companies report information on all of their breaches could even be counterproductive, causing defenders to stop actively monitoring for such incidents for fear of having to report them. These three distinct potential goals of security reporting policies rely on very different types of information, and this can put them at odds with each other. Breach notification generally involves reporting what information was breached and who was affected by that breach. This often translates into the sorts of media attention that firms most want to avoid, focused on the magnitude of breaches and the number of breached records, and that may discourage them from engaging in further sharing. Threat information sharing, by contrast, revolves around sharing specific threat signature information, or the ways that other defenders can identify current threats and remediate them. Reporting intended to contribute to longer-term data on threats and countermeasures would require yet a different set of information, including a detailed description of the root causes of security incidents and the defensive measures that were and were not in place when they occurred. This information, collected from a wide range of firms over time, could enable analysis of both the broader engineering design decisions that might combat the most common threats and the effectiveness of different existing countermeasures against these threats. There may be legitimate reasons to share each of these types of information with different actors at certain points, but where possible, restricting the fields of necessary data may help encourage participation from defenders. For instance, not requiring firms to report data about the magnitude of breaches may help assuage their concerns about the reputational damage that may be incurred by releasing that information. However, this strategy also has drawbacks and comes in direct conflict with many data breach notification laws, which specifically require breached organizations to report how many records were compromised or the number of individuals affected. Cyber insurance. The insights gleaned from compiling security incident data across different firms could help individual organizations make better investment and design decisions for security. They could also help drive the development of a more robust insurance market for these risks that standardizes and alleviates some of that individual responsibility. Insurers encounter many of the same challenges as individual firms when it comes to determining which defensive measures should be required of their customers and how to evaluate those customers' current defensive postures. An incident data repository could contribute to insurers' ability to make these determinations, besides offering greater insight into the frequency of common threats and the damages associated with them. Representatives of the insurance industry have themselves suggested that such a repository would be useful to their efforts. At a series of roundtables and workshops in 2012 and 2013, coordinated by the Department of Homeland Security's DHS, National Protection and Programs Directorate, insurance providers who were beginning to offer policies that covered cybersecurity incidents discussed how policymakers could help encourage the emerging market. The need for a security incident data repository was a major theme of these discussions, with insurers citing such data collection efforts as crucial to their efforts to model and quantify cyber risk for the purposes of underwriting insurance policies. A July 2014 DHS summary report on the meetings noted, most of the participants identified the federal government as being in a unique position to compile cyber incident data across sectors. In particular, they noted that it could help facilitate the sharing of anonymized information between the vendor and insurance industry communities regarding the top cyber risks that organizations face. It's striking that the insurers, who were trying to establish a market solution for cyber risk, were asking for help from policymakers. In order for their firms to be able to characterize computer-based risks and insure against them, in the same manner as health risks or car crashes or natural disasters, the insurance brokers first wanted some assistance from the government to help them better understand these risks. To price insurance policies, their understanding had to go well beyond just the data gleaned from companies reporting breaches of personal information under state reporting laws. For one thing, those laws only applied to incidents involving the theft of customer personal information, and many cybersecurity incidents, such as the Spamhaus DDoS attacks or the CryptoLocker ransomware, do not involve customer data being stolen. Furthermore, the information that breached firms are required to report under state breach notification laws typically does not include all of the things an insurer would want to know about an incident, such as how much it cost the firm, or what the root cause of the incident was, or what defenses were and were not in place when it occurred. Assembling the missing data on the frequency and financial impacts of cybersecurity incidents was not the only obstacle that insurers faced in trying to establish a robust market for cyber insurance. They, like the FTC, had been stymied by the challenges of trying to define a list of safeguards that their customers would be required to implement in order to be covered by their policies. Just as insurers place conditions on other types of policies, a fire insurance policy might only be valid if there are smoke detectors installed in the buildings it covers, for instance. So, too, when writing policies to cover customers' cyber risks, Insurers needed to be able to audit the overall effectiveness of those customers' security postures. The audits were supposed to help insurers figure out whether their potential customers were using good security controls or had effective monitoring systems, and also identify what additional measures, if any, the insurer might require to be put in place prior to offering coverage. But in order to do those assessments, insurers needed better guidance and better data on which controls actually worked to prevent or detect incidents. Their existing checklist method of asking firms whether they had certain safeguards and processes in place was not working, as several insurers said at the DHS meetings. Additionally, the various security recommendations and frameworks provided by the government were not sufficiently clear or specific to suit the insurance industry's purposes. Insurers cited in particular the NIST Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity as an example of a set of government security guidelines too ambiguous to use for evaluating firms' security. According to the DHS report, insurers argued, voluntary use of the framework must be accompanied by specific ongoing actions that apply its principles to a specific company's specific business processes. Absent this individualized application and measurement of results, so-called use of the framework loses much of its implied meaning for both insurance and other risk management purposes. This condemnation of the value of a major government cybersecurity initiative suggested just how useless many stakeholders in industry had found these government recommendations to be for actually trying to measure or quantify cyber risk and the impact of individual security controls. When it came to strengthening and assessing insurance customers' security, the insurers asked for two things from the U.S. government, besides better data: a ubiquitously recognized Smokey the Bear equivalent for cyber risk that could be used in public education campaigns, and a rating or symbol that publicizes the cybersecurity level of organizations. The former, insurers believed, would raise overall cybersecurity awareness among industry actors, while the latter would help insurers decide who to cover without needing to immediately build up their own in-depth security audit processes. Eventually, insurers believed they would have collected enough data from their own customers to be able to analyze for themselves which computer safeguards did and did not help, and to model the frequency and costs of cybersecurity incidents. However, while the market was still relatively new and included only a small number of customers, insurers wanted help from the government in order to grow this emerging market without going bankrupt. The threat of losing money on cyber insurance loomed large for insurers, not just because they were unsure how costly or how frequent cyber incidents were, and did not know which safeguards to require of their customers, but also because of how interconnected they feared cyber risks could be. Insurance markets operate on the assumption that insurers will not have to pay out claims to all of their customers simultaneously. To ensure this is the case, insurers seek a diverse pool of customers with very different demographic and geographic risk profiles. For instance, if there were an earthquake in California that required paying out claims to many customers there, an insurer could cover those costs with the premiums paid by customers located in other places who were not affected. But when it comes to cyber risk, it's tricky to know how to diversify that risk across different types of customers. One piece of malware targeting a popular operating system or other software program could potentially affect computers all over the world, in all different industry sectors. and all at once. Since cyber risks spread rapidly across networks, insurers suspected they could see massive cascading effects in the event of a major incident, and end up being forced to pay out claims to many customers simultaneously. This was yet another reason for them to move cautiously when it came to pricing and selling these policies, and another reason they wanted help from the government collecting the data they needed to profile the interconnectedness of cyber risks and model the associated costs accurately. Insurance is fundamentally an industry solution to handling risk. It's typically up to firms and individuals to purchase insurance policies, and up to insurers to design and price policies. And yet, for the cyber insurance industry to move forward and meet the anticipated demand for coverage, the insurance firms first wanted help from policymakers. The risk characterization and defense assessment enabled by aggregated security incident data could be used in more ways than just building actuarial models. It could also help pave the way for clearer liability standards surrounding security breaches, something that insurers could further help clarify through their policies covering these incidents. A clearer determination of what types of incidents an organization might reasonably be expected to defend against, as well as what measures should be taken to provide that level of protection, may help define what incidents an organization should and should not be liable for failing to prevent. These determinations are likely to evolve and be strongly influenced by the requirements imposed by insurers. In the absence of reliable data about incidents and defenses, however, there is a real risk that these ongoing liability disputes and lawsuits will continue to fail to yield concrete evidence for stakeholders about their responsibilities and leave insurers floundering as they try to figure out how to understand and model cyber risks. 14. Conclusion. It will take all of us. In the aftermath of major computer security incidents that involve the theft of millions of people's personal information, it is hard to feel much sympathy for the breached organizations. Why pity TJX, or the South Carolina Department of Revenue, or OPM, or DigiNotar, or Ashley Madison, when it was their own carelessness that allowed for millions of other people's credit cards, or fingerprint records, or email accounts to be compromised? When the leaders of those organizations begin pointing fingers and trying to show why other stakeholders are really the ones responsible for letting this happen, they look like they're desperately attempting to dodge blame and save their own jobs, and often they are. And yet, buried in even the most contemptible and cowardly of these blame game exercises, there is a profoundly true message. Protecting data and computer systems in an online networked world is not the work of any individual company or government agency. It is the work of many interconnected, interdependent stakeholders whose decisions influence each other's security and constrain each other's options. Consider, for instance, the plea of former OPM Director Catherine Archuleta for her role in the OPM breach to be understood in the larger context of her predecessors, colleagues, and the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the federal government. Pressed by Representative Chaffetz at a hearing on the breach to assign herself a grade for the work she had done and assess whether she was succeeding or failing at securing the OPM computer systems, Archuleta responded, "Cybersecurity problems are decades in the making. The whole of government is responsible, and it will take all of us to solve the issue and continue to work on them. My leadership with OPM is one that instigated the improvements and changes that recognized the attack. Archuletta's defense is both pitiful and poignant. Pitiful because she is so determined to paint herself as the agency's savior, as the person who discovered the breach but played no role in enabling it, and so completely unwilling to assume any blame for running an organization that, time and again, including during her tenure, ignored clear warnings about the poor state of its information security infrastructure. But she's also right. Cybersecurity problems of the kind OPM faced are decades in the making. The OPM institutional technology culture was one of ignoring security warnings and continuing to run insecure systems, relying on out-of-date tools and software, giving login access to a range of third-party contractors, storing sensitive files indefinitely, and employing slow bureaucratic procurement processes. But it was not an institutional culture entirely of Archuletta's own making. The OPM breach reflected not just her own misguided leadership of OPM, it also reflected the decisions made by her predecessors at the agency and other agencies all over the government. Decisions made by private companies manufacturing the software OPM relied on, decisions made by firms selling domain names and server space to the perpetrators of the breach, and decisions made by organizations that carried the massive volume of traffic exfiltrated from OPM's servers to external machines. On some level, the entire U.S. government was responsible for the OPM breach, though Archuletta was exactly the wrong person to be trying to point that out, when she herself was so clearly culpable as well. She's even right that it will take all of us, government and industry actors and individual end users alike, to make progress towards solving the threats posed by insecure computer systems, though, again, it's hard to imagine a worse courier for that particular message. One unfortunate feature of computer security incidents is that the people and companies who trumpet the importance of shared blame and shared responsibility in the aftermath of major breaches usually have very little credibility. No one listens to them because they are so clearly motivated by self-interest and self-preservation, so blatantly attempting to dodge blame for their own egregious mistakes. Wyndham, for instance, made a valid point when it argued that the FTC had not clarified what defensive measures companies needed to have in place to provide their customers with reasonable security for their personal information. But the court had no patience for this argument, precisely because Wyndham hadn't even done the bare minimum, regardless of how that bare minimum was or was not defined. Wyndham was every bit as guilty of blatantly disregarding data security practices as Archuletta. However, as with Archuletta's appeal to Congress, there is a kernel of truth underlying Wyndham's desperate attempts to absolve itself of blame. Yes, Wyndham and Archuletta made a series of appallingly terrible, obviously stupid, outrageously careless decisions about computer security. And yes, they could have done a much better job of protecting the data they were entrusted with. But they also could have used some better outside support. The same could be said of the South Carolina Department of Revenue, looking to the IRS for guidance on how to protect tax filings, and of Cloudflare for pointing the finger at operators of OpenDNS resolvers for enabling the denial of service attacks directed at Spamhaus. We're only one tiny piece of a much larger network, Wyndham and Archuletta and so many other breach victims seem to be saying, in the aftermath of their own disgrace. Please don't leave us out here on our own.